"You're Zariah Bennett?" The man's voice cracked slightly, his face paling as though he had seen a ghost. His name was Everett Dalton, and he couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. This isn't going to work," he stammered, taking a step back on the quiet platform of Rosefield Station. "You didn't mention that you were black." Zariah lifted her chin. "I believe the word you're searching for is black, Mr. Dalton, and no, I didn't mention it. You never asked." The delicate cream hat perched atop her head, chosen so carefully for this moment, now felt like a cruel joke. She had crossed 3 states, endured 3 grueling weeks of travel, and clutched 6 months of heartfelt letters close to her chest. She'd carried a trunk filled with hope, fleeing the veiled racism of the city in search of a second chance. Everett's hand trembled, crushing the bouquet of roses he'd brought, now wilting with the moment. In your letters you sounded so refined. I imagined something different." Zariah stood tall, keeping her voice calm despite the storm inside. "Different how, Mr. Dalton? More pale? Less threatening to your standing in this little town? You wrote of loneliness and a yearning for understanding. Not once did you say anything about skin color." Everett scanned the station, eyes darting to the small crowd of curious townsfolk now stealing glances. A black woman, dressed like a lady, being rejected in public. It was already a scandal. "You must understand my situation," he muttered, flustered. "This town, my reputation, my business. You can't afford to be seen with someone like me," she finished for him, voice sharp but steady. He dug into his coat and pulled out a fistful of wrinkled bills. "Here," he said awkwardly. "This should get you a place to stay until you can figure things out." Zariah didn't flinch. The wind brushed against her face, but it wasn't the cold that made her skin prickle. It was fury held tightly in check. This man had poured his soul into those letters, painting himself as a gentle, misunderstood widower aching for connection. Now the mask had fallen. Beneath it, he was just another man terrified of what others might say. But before she could reply, a low, commanding voice sliced through the air like a blade. "That's your answer, Everett? Throw money at her like she's a burden you want gone?" Both of them turned to see a tall man stepping forward from the edge of the platform. His boots were worn but well kept, his coat plain yet made of fine material. He wasn't dressed for show, but for someone who owned half the land in the region. "Colton Granger," Everett muttered, voice faltering. "This doesn't concern you." Colton's eyes narrowed. "It does when I see a man I've done business with for 15 years act like a spineless coward." He turned to Zariah, his voice softening. "Ma'am, Colton Granger. I own Magnolia Hill just outside town. If you'll permit me, I'd like to offer you a room at my estate. No strings attached, just a roof and some peace, until you decide what you want to do." Zariah hesitated. She'd learned long ago that offers from strangers often came with hidden prices. But Colton's tone held no pity, only quiet conviction. Everett choked on indignation. "You can't be serious, Colton. What will the town say?" Colton smirked. "The same town that eats from my hand? Let them talk." Zariah stood motionless, caught between wounded pride and the stark reality that she had nowhere else to go. Behind her, the train hissed its final warning before pulling away. She lifted her chin, clutching the handle of her trunk. "I'll accept your offer," she said firmly, "but just for a few nights." As the carriage rolled away from the station, Everett Dalton remained frozen in place, clutching his crumpled bills like a man who had just let something priceless slip through his fingers. What no one at that station knew, not Everett, not the onlookers, not even Colton, was that Zariah Bennett hadn't arrived in Rosefield empty-handed. Buried beneath her modest clothes and battered trunk was a secret that would one day shake the foundations of the town. A secret that would make Everett Dalton regret that moment for the rest of his life. The journey to Magnolia Hill was quiet. Save for the gentle clatter of the carriage wheels and the occasional whinny of the horses, Zariah sat stiffly, unsure whether to be grateful or guarded. Colton Granger was a stranger, and in her experience, kindness, especially from white men, often carried a price tag, whether spoken or not. But Colton didn't press her with questions. Instead, he gazed out at the winding road ahead, letting the silence settle comfortably between them. When they finally turned onto a long private lane flanked by white-blossomed dogwoods, Zariah's breath caught. This wasn't a simple farmhouse. Magnolia Hill was a sprawling estate crowned by a stately Victorian mansion, its balconies draped in ivy, its windows gleaming in the soft glow of sunset. Surrounding it were vast, lush fields and distant pastures, where horses grazed, their movements serene and unbothered by the world beyond the gates. "This is your home?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Colton gave a small, almost sheepish nod. "It's more house than one man needs, truth be told." "People must talk," she murmured. "They always do. But talk doesn't keep my orchards alive or my employees paid," he said. "And in a town like Rosefield, being different means you're always under a magnifying glass." The carriage pulled up to the main steps, where a neatly dressed woman stood waiting. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, and eyes that assessed Zariah quickly but not unkindly. "Miss Bennett, this is Mrs. Loretta Moore, the housekeeper here for over 20 years. If you need anything, she's the one to ask." Mrs. Moore gave a courteous nod. "Your room is ready, ma'am. I've prepared the lavender suite. It overlooks the gardens." As Zariah followed her through the house, she noticed the rich wood-paneled walls, the antique chandeliers, the oil paintings that looked like they belonged in a museum. Yet everything was tasteful, lived in, and warm, not a display of wealth but a reflection of legacy. That night, after a quiet dinner served in a grand but cozy dining room, Colton shared his story. "I wasn't born here," he said, pushing aside his empty plate. "My father was a banker up north. My mother taught at a progressive school. They raised me to believe people were more than their skin or station." He poured her a cup of tea and sat across from her. "When I came to Rosefield 15 years ago, people looked at me like a curiosity. I had too much money to ignore, but too many opinions to trust. So I did what farmers do. I worked, and I let the land speak for me." Zariah studied him. There was something honest in his eyes. Still, she kept her guard up. "And what about you?" he asked gently. "Your letters must have made quite the impression on Mr. Dalton." Zariah paused, her fingers tightening slightly around her teacup. "I was a teacher," she said finally, "in Boston. I taught literature and history to young girls of color. When the school closed, I realized it was time to try something new." She didn't tell him everything. Not yet. She didn't mention the inheritance left by her grandfather, a man who'd served a prominent Southern family for most of his life, or the chest of gold coins he'd saved in secret, or the bundle of brittle yellowing papers she had hidden beneath the false bottom of her travel trunk. Papers that bore signatures, seals, and a map, documents that tied her family's name to the very soil Rosefield was built upon. For now, she simply smiled politely and changed the subject. Over the next few days, Zariah found herself surrounded by a strange kind of stillness. It wasn't the emptiness she had feared, nor the hushed tension of being unwelcome. Rather, Magnolia Hill seemed to offer her something she hadn't had in years: space to breathe. Colton didn't pressure her to share more. Instead, he simply made room for her presence, her silence, her curiosity. When she asked about the library, his face lit up. "It's in the East Wing. A whole room of books that no one's organized since my grandfather passed. You're welcome to use it." Zariah explored it the very next morning. What she found took her by surprise. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes, old newspapers, local maps, and dusty land records going back decades. The air smelled of parchment and lavender polish. There was even a ladder on wheels, something she had only seen in prestigious institutions. By the second day, she was deep into local histories and legal texts. On the third, she was cross-referencing property lines and town ledgers. Each document added a piece to the puzzle she had carried silently since Boston. Colton had given her a place to sleep, but he had also unknowingly given her access to the past and the evidence she needed to correct a buried injustice. When asked what she was studying, she would smile, just broadening my horizons. Word of her presence didn't take long to spread through Rosefield. Whispers fluttered from porch to porch, from bakery counters to church pews. Most townsfolk had never seen a black woman dressed like a city-born lady, sipping tea with Colton Granger in broad daylight. Mrs. Moore, however, was unfazed. "Some folks need time to adjust," she said one morning as she adjusted the curtains in Zariah's room. "But you're not the first person to shake this town's roots, and you won't be the last." By the end of the week, visitors began arriving at Magnolia Hill uninvited, bringing excuses to speak with Colton, but casting sideways glances at Zariah. Colton handled them with ease, sipping his tea as if the intrusion was part of the scenery. "They're all so curious," he muttered after one particularly forced visit from the pastor's wife. "You haven't even set foot in town, and yet you've become Rosefield's favorite roomer." Zariah gave a dry smile. "I've always been a spectacle, Mr. Granger. The only thing that's changed is the furniture I'm sitting on while they watch." It was during one of these tense afternoons that Everett Dalton returned. He showed up without warning, hat in hand, face pinched with feigned concern. As Mrs. Moore led him to the sitting room, Colton raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I came to see how Miss Bennett is doing," Everett announced with a forced smile. "She's quite comfortable," Colton said coolly. "Why not ask her yourself?" Zariah entered the room moments later, no longer the weary, travel-worn woman from the train station. She wore a silk dress Mrs. Moore had tailored for her hair pinned in a neat twist, her steps confident. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice like ice over glass. "What an unexpected visit." Everett swallowed. The community is concerned. You're still staying here, and some believe it's not proper. An unmarried woman under the roof of an unmarried man, especially when she's black." Colton finished for him, voice dangerously low. "Go on, Everett, I'd like to hear you say it." Everett's mouth opened, then closed. He shifted awkwardly. Zariah stepped forward. "The church committee is welcome to worry, but I'm afraid I won't be returning to Boston anytime soon." "You can't be serious," Everett gasped. "You have no ties here, no family, no job." "I have both," Zariah interrupted. "Mr. Granger has offered me a position, librarian. Apparently generations of Grangers have been terrible at organizing their collection." Colton leaned back in his chair, nodding in agreement. Her talents were too great to let go to waste. What neither man said, but both understood, was that this job meant more than books. The Granger Library held not only stories and classics, but buried truths, records that tied names to land, transactions that painted a different picture of Rosefield's past. Everett paled. "You're playing with fire," he muttered. "Digging up things better left buried." Zariah met his gaze without blinking. "Then perhaps it's time someone finally did the digging." As Everett Dalton stormed out of Magnolia Hill, his pride more bruised than ever, Colton watched from the parlor window, a glimmer of both amusement and caution in his eyes. "He's not the type to take embarrassment lightly," he remarked. "Expect whispers, maybe even trouble." Zariah nodded, her gaze calm but resolute. "Let him whisper. I've lived through worse than his disapproval." But even as she dismissed Everett's threats, Zariah knew she had stirred something deeper, an old wound the town had spent decades trying to forget. By day, she fulfilled her role as librarian with grace and diligence. But by night, she returned to her secret mission. In the stillness of the library, she pored over parchment-thin deeds, handwritten ledgers, and aging town maps. She wasn't just organizing dusty books, she was reconstructing a history deliberately fragmented. Each night unearthed more truths. One record led to another. Names she'd only heard in whispers back in Boston suddenly appeared again and again. Land transactions, sheriff reports, and census papers altered in suspicious ways. Over and over a pattern emerged. Properties once owned by freed black men after the Civil War, mysteriously lost, sold under duress, or reassigned through hastily passed town ordinances. And then came the revelation that shook her to her core. Fragile deed dated 1866, signed by the then governor of the state, granting nearly two-thirds of modern-day Rosefield to one Josiah Freeman, her great-grandfather, a freed man, a landowner, a victim of history rewritten by force. She pulled out the matching document from her trunk, the one passed down by her mother and hidden for generations. The signatures matched, the seals matched, the coordinates matched. Her great-grandfather had owned the very land that Everett Dalton's store now stood on. Mrs. Moore, ever observant, noticed Zariah's late-night habits. "You're looking for something more than old books, aren't you?" she asked one evening as she brought her a cup of herbal tea. Zariah hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'm looking for the truth, and I think I'm very close to finding it." The next week, the town's curiosity turned to unease. The ladies, who once gossiped politely, now whispered with clenched jaws. The pastor's sermons suddenly featured vague warnings about outsiders meddling in God's ordained order. Everett Dalton, red-faced and anxious, was seen at City Hall almost daily, consulting clerks and pressuring council members. And yet, Zariah remained composed. She knew something no one else did. She wasn't alone. Hidden behind the formality and reserve, Colton Granger was watching it all, and quietly supporting her. He had begun pointing out missing gaps in his family records. He ensured her access to every corner of the estate's archives. And when the local notary suddenly denied her request for copies of public land maps, Colton had sent his personal lawyer to intervene. "Why are you helping me?" she asked one evening as they walked through the orchard. Colton paused, then looked at her. "Because I've read enough history to know that silence is the worst kind of betrayal. If the truth is on your side, it deserves light." Zariah smiled, touched by his words, but she had learned never to trust sentiments too easily. Still, something between them had shifted. No longer was she just the rejected mail-order bride. No longer was he simply the aloof landowner. In their quiet conversations, in the way he waited for her to finish a thought, in how she now addressed him without caution, there was something growing. Trust, perhaps, or the fragile beginnings of something even deeper. But Rosefield wasn't ready for that, and Zariah knew the storm was only just beginning. 2 weeks after Zariah's arrival in Rosefield, the tension that had been simmering quietly began to boil over. It started with hushed conversations on church porches, then escalated into organized whispers at the local general store. Some called for preserving tradition, others spoke more bluntly. Colton Granger had brought trouble into town. The final spark came when Everett Dalton, red-faced and loud, demanded an emergency town meeting. The small wooden hall that doubled as the council chamber was soon filled to the brim. Every founding family, every influential merchant, and every landowner in Rosefield showed up that day, not for discussion but for confrontation. "She's undermining the fabric of our town," Everett bellowed from the center aisle, gesturing wildly. "Colton Granger is harboring a stranger, an outsider with no regard for propriety. And that woman, she's digging, looking into things that don't concern her. Rumors of legal documents, stolen land, old grievances. It's dangerous." Chorus of murmurs followed. Some nodded. Others exchanged uneasy glances. The truth was, many of them had long suspected that their land histories weren't as clean as they'd claimed. Then, without warning, the double doors of the hall creaked, opened. Colton Granger entered with deliberate calm, and beside him, dressed in navy blue with her curls pinned high and a leather briefcase in hand, walked Zariah Bennett. The crowd fell silent. Colton's voice was clear and firm. "I appreciate the town's invitation, though I was not aware. We were hosting public trials without notice." "This isn't a trial," Everett spat. "This is an intervention. You've endangered this town's peace and respectability." Zariah stepped forward, her voice like silk over steel. "Respectability? Is that what you call rewriting history?" Gasps echoed across the room. "Let's be clear," she continued. "I am not here as Colton Granger's guest. I am here as a legal representative of a matter that affects every person in this town." Everett laughed nervously. Legal representative? You're a school teacher, Miss Bennett, not a lawyer, not someone with authority. Zariah clicked open her briefcase and slowly retrieved a yellow deed sealed with wax and stamped by the state. I am also the granddaughter of Josiah Freeman, a name many of you may pretend not to remember. The name dropped like a stone into a still pond. An older man in the back gasped audibly. A few others turned pale. This is the original deed, Zariah said, holding it up, granted by Governor Samuel Wright in 1866. It awarded Josiah Freeman, my great-grandfather, ownership of over 60% of what is now Rosefield, including your store, Mr. Dalton. Judge Alton Hemsworth, the town's senior official, adjusted his glasses and took the document carefully. This seal, this paper, now it looks authentic. It's fake, Everett barked. Urban legend. There's no proof. I have the accompanying records, Zariah said coolly. Signed affidavits, letters of sale, and evidence of how Josiah Freeman was run out of town under threat of lynching. You called it a myth, Mr. Dalton, but I call it history. Colton added, funny how the town archives from 1870 to 1872 were missing, until Zariah found overlapping records in our estate's library. Land transfers, private council minutes, a Riverfield Property Committee, which was simply a cover, to seize land from a man who couldn't defend himself. The room rippled with shock. Several townspeople sat back in their chairs, mouths agape. Everett's face was now crimson. You're trying to tear this town apart. Zariah stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. No, I'm trying to put it back together the right way. What was stolen doesn't need to be punished, it needs to be acknowledged. I'm proposing a community trust, she continued, funded by restitution, not from your homes, but from land profits and grants. A foundation for schools, affordable housing, and scholarships. One that carries Josiah Freeman's name. Justice doesn't have to destroy. It can rebuild. A heavy silence settled over the room, and then, in a moment no one expected, Judge Hemsworth stood and cleared his throat. I was raised to believe that the truth matters, he said. These documents, they warrant verification. But if they're legitimate, this town has a debt to pay. Everett looked around the room, waiting for someone to stand with him. No one did. He turned to Zariah, his face twisted in disbelief. You planned this from the start. You lured me with letters so you could destroy everything. Zariah's voice softened. I wrote to you with sincerity, Mr. Dalton, but it was your rejection, not my plan, that revealed your true nature. You judged me the second you saw my skin, just as your ancestors judged mine. All I've done is respond. Everett collapsed into his seat, defeated. What he couldn't know, what no one could yet see, was that the woman they had tried to push out was now rewriting the story of Rosefield, and the pen was in her hand. The town meeting ended in chaos. Heated whispers spilled into the streets. Some residents shuffled home in stunned silence. Others argued outside City Hall, still trying to process the weight of what had been revealed. Inside the chamber, Judge Hemsworth carefully sealed the documents Zariah had presented. These records will be sent to the State Historical Commission. Immediately, he said. If validated, which I believe they will be, we will have no choice but to accept the truth. Everett Dalton didn't speak again. He sat hunched in his seat, sweat glistening on his forehead, his store and his legacy hanging by a thread. As the crowd dispersed, Colton turned to Zariah, admiration in his eyes. You didn't just challenge them. You held the entire town accountable without losing your grace. Zariah looked toward the back of the hall, where a faded painting of Rosefield's founding fathers hung on the wall. They always told us history was written by the victors, she murmured. They never mentioned what happened when the truth outlived the lies. Outside, the press had already begun circling. A few reporters from nearby towns had caught wind of the controversy. The town clerk, nervously chewing on his pen, whispered that the news would spread by morning. Zariah, however, wasn't interested in attention. Her focus remained on the next steps. Later that night, back at Magnolia Hill, Colton poured her a glass of wine as they sat on the veranda. You had every right to demand everything, he said softly. Reparations, full ownership, public apologies. Soraya looked out over the rolling hills that once belonged to her grandfather, land that had been tilled, taxed, and traded without a second thought for the man who'd once owned it all. I don't want revenge, she said. I want restoration. I want the next generation to know the truth, and to have something better than what was taken from us. Colton was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a letter. I didn't tell you this before, he said, handing it to her. But I had heard of Josiah Freeman before you came. My grandfather mentioned him once, called him the man whose name we don't speak. I found this in one of his journals. Soraya unfolded the brittle paper. It was a map, hand-drawn with annotations marking the original Freeman boundaries. It confirmed everything she had already discovered. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. I used to think all I had was a story my mother told me on quiet nights. But now, I have proof. Colton placed a hand over hers. You have more than proof. You have power, and you're using it with more wisdom than any councilman ever has. Soraya smiled, faintly. They'll fight me, there'll be appeals, accusations, more rumors. He nodded. But they'll lose. Because you're not alone anymore. The stars above Magnolia Hill glistened in the sky like scattered truths, finally brought into the light. And somewhere deep in her heart, Soraya knew. This wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about reclaiming a story. Days after the town meeting, the quiet streets of Rosefield hummed with nervous energy. In every diner, shop, and church foyer, the same question echoed. What happens now? The answer came swiftly. The State Historical Records Commission validated the documents Soraya had submitted. The deed, the signatures, the old council minutes, the land transfers, it was all real, legally binding, undeniable. The news hit the town like a lightning strike. The headline ran in the Rosefield Gazette, Freeman family rightful owners of V. Majority of town land, legacy hidden for 150 years. The response was split. Some were outraged, fearful of lawsuits and forced evictions. Others were quietly ashamed, realizing for the first time the privileges they had unknowingly inherited from theft and silence. But it was Soraya's next move that stunned everyone. Instead of suing each landowner individually, she filed for the creation of the Freeman Trust Foundation, a nonprofit that would reclaim profits from the illegally occupied lands and reinvest them into the town's future. Affordable housing, education grants, a library, a youth center. I'm not here to tear down homes, she announced at a press conference outside City Hall. I'm here to build one big enough to include everyone. Even her critics were caught off guard. There was no rage, no bitterness, just purpose. Everett Dalton, however, was not ready to go quietly. He stormed into the courthouse demanding injunctions, filing complaints against the council and against Colton Granger personally. But his voice, once loud in the town's ears, now sounded shrill and desperate. His store saw a sharp drop in customers. Neighbors began crossing the street to avoid him. The community he once controlled had begun to slip from his grip. In a last-ditch attempt to salvage his reputation, Everett called another public meeting, this time to discredit Soraya. She planned this from the start, he insisted, waving her letters in the air. She targeted me, manipulated the town. This was a scheme. Soraya attended the meeting in person, standing before the townsfolk with quiet composure. I wrote those letters with sincerity, she said. I believed in the chance for something honest. What happened at that train station? That wasn't part of a plan. That was you, Mr. Dalton. That was your decision to see my skin before my heart. The room fell silent. Then Judge Hemsworth stood. We've all seen the evidence. What matters now is how we respond, not to punish but to make right what was wrong for over a century. Colton spoke next. Soraya could have demanded your home, your business, your legacy. But instead she offered you dignity. That's more than you ever offered her. Everett collapsed into a chair, defeated. It was over. the council moved quickly. A land adjustment committee was formed. The Freeman Trust was given oversight of the historical land areas. Colton donated several acres from his own estate to be developed into a cultural and educational center. The transformation had begun, and through it all, Zariah never lost her calm. At a small dinner held weeks later in the renovated Rosefield Hall, the same place where she had once been scorned, townspeople rose one by one to thank her. Teachers, farmers, shopkeepers. Not for what she had taken, but for what she had given. Future built on truth. 6 months after Zariah Bennett first stepped off the train at Rosefield Station, the town she had once entered as an unwelcome stranger had been irrevocably changed. The Freeman Trust Foundation, now fully operational, was not just a legal institution, it was a living monument to accountability and renewal. Funds recovered from land profits were already being used to renovate abandoned buildings into learning centers and housing for struggling families. The most symbolic transformation of all, however, was Everett Dalton's old general store. Once, a place that had refused to sell to black patrons during Jim Crow and had shunned Zariah upon her arrival, it had now become the Freeman Public Library, Rosefield's first community-funded, fully inclusive learning space. The shelves, once stocked with overpriced goods and narrow thinking, now held books about truth, justice, and the histories that had long been erased. Zariah's vision was not just about restoring land. It was about giving the town its conscience. I guess for Everett Dalton, he quietly sold what remained of his business, packed his belongings, and left Rosefield. Rumor had it he worked as a store clerk in a nearby town, far from the streets where his name had once carried power. Colton and Zariah walked the estate one golden afternoon, past children laughing in the new community garden where an exclusive rose maze once bloomed only for the Granger family. "You had every right to destroy him," Colton said, watching a group of students paint murals on the side of the library. "Most people would have." Zariah smiled, her eyes reflecting the warm light of the setting sun. "Revenge might have felt good for a day, but this," she gestured around her, "this will last generations." She had declined all interviews from national media. While journalists flooded in to cover the remarkable turnaround in Rosefield, Zariah remained focused. Her mission was never about personal glory, it was about legacy and justice and healing. A few months later, during a community celebration at the estate, now named the Freeman Granger Cultural Center, Judge Hemsworth raised a toast. "To the woman who reminded us that justice isn't just a courtroom ruling. It's a commitment, a practice, a vision," he said, voice thick with emotion. "We thought we knew who Zariah Bennett was when she arrived. We were wrong. She's not just a woman who sought change. She became it." Martha Lucas, once a teacher at the segregated schoolhouse and now principal of the new Freeman Academy, added, "And to think, it all started with a cruel rejection on a train platform." Colton turned to Zariah, his hand finding hers gently. "The best thing Everett Dalton ever did was push you away," he whispered with a smile. "Though I doubt he'd agree." Zariah laughed softly, leaning against him as music played in the distance and children danced beneath the lanterns. Inoi, the old town square, where statues of colonial landowners once stood, a new bronze plaque had been unveiled. Modest and dignified, it bore the story of Josiah Freeman, the man who had owned Rosefield before it was taken from him, and the woman who had brought his name back to life with honor. The plaque read, "In memory of Josiah Freeman, whose legacy could not be buried, and whose heir taught us that true justice begins not in reclaiming what was stolen, but in rebuilding what was lost." As night fell, Zariah looked out over the place that had once scorned her, a place now filled with possibility. She had come with nothing but a trunk, a bundle of letters, and a hidden truth. Now she stood with a community behind her, a future ahead of her, and a man beside her who had seen her strength, not her color. Rosefield had been reborn, and this time, its foundation was truth. As fall colored the trees of Rosefield in fiery gold and crimson, Zariah found herself busier than ever. She traveled to nearby cities to speak at universities, sharing not just her personal journey but the legal and Historical process she used to uncover the truth about her family's legacy. Historians began taking a second look at long-dismissed legends of displaced black landowners, using Zariah's case as a blueprint for restorative justice. Reporters came from as far as Chicago and Atlanta. Documentaries were proposed. Panels were organized. And through it all, Zariah remained grounded, refusing book deals, declining sensational headlines. "This was never about me," she told one young journalist. "This was about a family's name being erased and a community's chance to choose what kind of people they want to be." At the heart of all this stood Magnolia Hill, now co-owned by Zariah and Colton, not just as a home but as the Freeman Granger Cultural Center, a place of learning, reconciliation, and growth. What was once a bastion of old wealth had become a haven for new beginnings. Zariah walked its halls now with the same quiet authority that had once startled Everett Dalton. But now that presence was celebrated. Her portraits, painted by a local black artist, hung beside those of her ancestors, reclaiming not just space, but story. One cool evening, 6 months after the city council vote, Colton and Zariah sat on the porch overlooking the now integrated schoolyard. Children of all backgrounds played where once only white children had been allowed. Zariah wrapped her fingers around a warm cup of tea, her eyes scanning the joyful scene before her. "Do you ever think about how different it could have been?" she asked softly. Colton smiled. "Every day. If Everett hadn't rejected you at that train station, if he hadn't reduced me to nothing more than a color," she finished. He nodded. "And yet," she whispered, "it was that rejection that set everything in motion." Colton turned to her. "You know what's ironic?" Zariah raised an eyebrow. He couldn't imagine sharing a life with someone who didn't look like him. But it was that narrowness that destroyed him, and it was your depth, your strength, your dignity that saved this town. Zariah looked at him for a long moment. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think they'll remember?" She asked. 50 years from now, will they remember Josiah Freeman? The truth? "They'll remember," he said, "because you carved it into the foundation." The moon rose above Rosefield, casting its gentle glow across the hills Josiah Freeman had once walked. A breeze swept through the tall grass, almost like a whisper of approval from the past. Zariah Bennett, now Zariah Bennett Granger, had come. To Rosefield, a rejected woman with a broken dream. She had left behind something far greater. She had rewritten history, not with anger, not with vengeance, but with truth, grace, and the unwavering belief that dignity would always outshine hate. And, as she held Colton's hand beneath the stars, she knew this was only the beginning of the real legacy she had come to build.